Forget everything you think you know about Victorian romance. Forget the blushing virgins, the handsome gentleman calling with a bouquet of flowers, the stolen glances across a crowded ballroom. Erase the image of a delicate hand placed gently on a strong forearm, the promise of a lifetime of chaste, devoted love shimmering in the gaslight. That's the story we tell ourselves, the historical fiction we binge-watch, the comforting lie that papers over a reality so filthy, so terrifying, and so profoundly septic, you'd need a gallon of carbolic acid just to stomach the description. We imagine corsets and repressed desire. The reality was closer to uterine prolapse and uncontrolled syphilis. We picture love letters written in elegant script. They were more concerned with letters from a quack doctor promising a mercury cure that would make their teeth fall out. The great dark secret of the 19th century isn't that they were prudes, it's that they were drowning in a sea of their own bodily fluids, armed with nothing but superstition, shame, and a few terrifyingly pointy medical instruments. Their attempts at sexual hygiene were a masterclass in anatomical horror, a darkly hilarious tragedy of errors where the cure was almost always worse than the disease, and the disease was a slow, liquefying march to the grave. Imagine being a woman, taught from birth that your body is a sinful labyrinth of potential corruption. Your blood, your sweat, your very breath are sources of shame. Now imagine being told you must navigate the most intimate act of your life, an act already freighted with damnation, using tools and techniques that sound like they were invented by a bored torturer. Think less about gentle lovemaking and more about a desperate, clumsy chemical warfare campaign waged inside your own flesh. This wasn't about pleasure, it was about damage control. It was about plugging leaks, scrubbing away sin, and praying to a silent God that the transaction didn't leave you with a festering sore, a baby you couldn't feed, or a hole in the roof of your mouth. The Victorian era wasn't a period of quiet, respectable repression. It was a loud, festering, agonizing scream, muffled by layers of petticoats and the thick, unbreachable walls of social hypocrisy. Tonight we're not just opening a history book. We're prying open a medical bag from hell, and we're going to look at the gory, oozing, and tragically human mess that was sex in an age of profound ignorance. Sound romantic? It wasn't. Hang on, before we start oozing through the grime of the past, I need to know who's in quarantine with me. Tell me in the comments where you're isolating and what time it is. I want to picture your clean, modern surroundings before we get disgusting. Ready to feel sick? Let's begin. Let's start with the preparation, the pre-ritual, because no descent into hell begins without a few preliminary steps of self-abasement. Picture a young woman, maybe a housemaid, maybe a factory girl, maybe a respectable wife about to perform her marital duty. The air in her small, cold room is thick with the scent of coal dust and boiled cabbage. There is no gleaming bathroom, no hot running water, no neatly packaged products promising pH balance and floral freshness. There is a ceramic basin filled with lukewarm, slightly greasy water, a rough sliver of lye soap that strips the skin, and a pervasive sense of anxiety that clings to the air like damp. Her first order of business is the douching. This isn't the gentle, sterile procedure you might imagine. The tool of choice is a vulcanized rubber syringe, a menacing-looking thing with a hard nozzle, often shared between sisters or roommates, rinsed hastily and shoved back in a drawer. And what goes in it? Not a soothing saline solution. The Victorian woman's arsenal was a chemical horror show. The most common ingredient was carbolic acid, a caustic disinfectant that would make your eyes water from across the room. A few drops too many, and the delicate tissues of the vagina were burned, seared into a state of raw, painful inflammation. The goal wasn't comfort, it was annihilation. The goal was to create a hostile, sterile wasteland where no sin or sperm could survive. Other popular options included alum, a powerful astringent that would cause the tissues to contract violently, creating a sensation of painful, unnatural tightness. Or bichloride of mercury, a literal poison, absorbed directly into the bloodstream in the name of a misguided sense of cleanliness. She would perform this ritual squatting over a chamber pot, shivering in the cold, the acrid smell of chemicals filling her nostrils. There was no understanding of a healthy vaginal microbiome. To them, all discharge was a sign of disease, all natural scent a mark of filth. They were trying to scour their insides as if they were scrubbing a dirty floor, and the physical cost was immense. Chronic pain, infections, chemical burns, and a complete dissociation from their own bodies were the price of this so-called hygiene. Then came the smell. In an era before effective deodorants, the fear of body odor was paramount. A woman might rub a paste of ammonia and water into her armpits, another stinging, burning sensation. She would dust herself with powders, often containing lead or arsenic, which slowly poisoned her while providing a pale, fashionable complexion. A few drops of cheap, cloying perfume, rosewater or violet, were dabbed behind the ears, not to entice, but to mask. It was a futile attempt to overlay the scent of life with the scent of a funeral parlor. And what of contraception? This was the true heart of the terror. For a woman, an unwanted pregnancy was a death sentence of a different kind: social ruin, economic disaster, or a trip to a back-alley abortionist from whom she might not return. The methods were a grim cocktail of folklore and desperation. The most common was the belief in the douching itself, that a harsh enough chemical blast immediately after sex could wash away the danger. It was, of course, horribly ineffective. Then there was the sponge. A sea sponge, sometimes tied with a ribbon for easier retrieval, would be soaked in a spermicidal solution. Quinine was popular, or vinegar, or the aforementioned carbolic acid, and inserted deep into the vagina. Imagine the scratchy, alien texture of that, lodged inside you for hours. Imagine the fear of it getting lost, of not being able to retrieve it, a festering, chemical-soaked lump hidden inside your own body. For the man, preparation was simpler, but still steeped in anxiety. He might wash himself from a similar basin of cold water. He might carry a protector, a condom, but these were not the latex wonders we know. They were made from animal intestines, specifically sheep cecum, cleaned, treated with sulfur, and sold reusable. They were thick, clumsy, and notoriously unreliable, often referred to as armor rather than a prophylactic. Each one had to be washed, dried, and powdered after use, a grim and intimate chore. A man might inspect his own body with a growing sense of dread, looking for the first sign of the pox, the chancre that signaled the beginning of the end. He might swig some whiskey for courage, the burn in his throat a prelude to other, more sinister burns to come. This entire process for both man and woman was not about preparing for an act of intimacy. It was about girding for battle. It was a series of small, painful, humiliating rituals designed to mitigate the inevitable damage of a biological imperative that society had deemed fundamentally shameful. The air wasn't filled with anticipation, it was filled with the metallic tang of fear and the chemical stench of a desperate losing war against nature itself. Now let's pull back and look at the room. The environment where this grim theatre unfolds is not a backdrop, it's an active participant, a co-conspirator in the shame and the filth. Forget the opulent, velvet-draped boudoirs of historical dramas. Most of these encounters took place in spaces that were architectural expressions of human misery. We have to consider the two poles of this world, the high-class brothel and the low-class crib, because while they looked different, they both served the same function of processing human flesh for profit, and both were saturated with a unique kind of despair. Let's start at the top, in a so-called respectable parlour house in a city like London or New York. From the outside, it's an elegant brownstone, indistinguishable from the home of a wealthy merchant. Inside, the illusion of class is meticulously maintained, but it's a thin veneer. The gaslight is kept deliberately dim, not for romance, but to hide the stains on the crimson velvet settees and the frayed edges of the Persian rugs. The air is a thick soup of contradictory smells, the cloying sweetness of cheap perfume and incense burning to mask the underlying notes of stale cigar smoke, spilled whiskey, sweat, and the faint, ever-present metallic odor of blood. You'd hear the tinkle of a poorly tuned piano from the parlor downstairs, a frantic, cheerful tune that feels grotesquely out of place, a soundtrack for a silent horror film. The architectural details are designed for commerce and control. The rooms, or boudoir, are small, often windowless, with heavy doors that lock from the outside. The bed is the centerpiece, a grand four-poster perhaps, but the mattress is a lumpy landscape of straw or horsehair, rustling with every movement, a perfect home for bedbugs and fleas. Beside the bed, a marble-topped washstand holds the tools of the trade. A heavy ceramic pitcher and basin, the water inside already filmed with a greasy sheen. A stack of rough, greying towels, and the more sinister items, the rubber syringe for douching, a bottle of carbolic acid solution, a pot of lead-based face powder, a jar of mercury-laced preventative ointment. These aren't personal items, they are communal, used by whichever woman is assigned to the room that night, and on whichever man pays the price. The very air in this room feels heavy, used up. It's a space that has absorbed countless gallons of shame and desperation, and it breathes it back at you. Now let's slide down the scale to the other end of the spectrum, the crib. This is the reality for the vast majority of prostitutes, especially in the boom towns of the American West or the slums of industrial England. A crib is not a room, it's a stall. Imagine a long, narrow shed partitioned into tiny, cell-like spaces, each one just big enough for a narrow cot and perhaps a crate to sit on. The walls are thin, unpainted planks, offering no privacy. You can hear every cough, every sob, every grunt and slap from the stalls on either side. The smell here is less complex and far more honest. It's the raw, overpowering stench of unwashed bodies, cheap gin, vomit, and chamber pots that are emptied only once a day. The light, if any, comes from a single, smoky tallow candle that sputters and drips, casting long, dancing shadows that make the small space feel even more like a cage. The bed is a thin, straw pallet on the floor, crawling with lice and God knows what else. The straw is damp, stained with the fluids of countless anonymous encounters, and is rarely, if ever, changed. It's a breeding ground for disease, a scratchy, miserable surface for a miserable act. The tools here are even cruder. A bucket of cold, scummy water serves as the communal wash basin for the entire row of cribs. A shared, tattered rag serves as a towel. There might be a bottle of vinegar or a solution of zinc sulfate used as a harsh, ineffective douche. There is no pretense of hygiene or comfort. The environment is a physical manifestation of the woman's status. She is disposable, interchangeable, and not even worthy of a clean place to lie down. The architecture is pure, brutalist capitalism. The cribs are designed for maximum occupancy and minimum overhead. In both the high-class brothel and the low-class crib, the environment reinforces the power dynamic. The dim lighting, the heavy doors, the lack of clean water, it all serves to isolate and control the woman while providing a fantasy, however thin, for the man. The setting isn't just where the act happens. It's a weapon, a tool of the trade that grinds down the spirit, infects the body, and ensures that the entire transaction remains shrouded in a necessary, profitable filth. It's a room that is actively trying to kill you, slowly. In this theatre of filth and fear, someone has to be the director. Power isn't an abstract concept here. It's a person, an institution, a set of rules written in invisible, indelible ink. And the figures who wield this power are masters of a particularly grotesque form of hypocrisy. They are the architects of the system, the ones who profit from the shame they simultaneously enforce. Let's meet the two primary authority figures in this world, the madam and the doctor. First, the madam. Forget the buxom, jovial figure with a heart of gold you've seen in movies. The real Victorian brothel keeper was a ruthless entrepreneur, a shark swimming in a sea of desperation. She was often a former prostitute herself, one who had managed to survive and claw her way into a position of management. This didn't make her sympathetic. It made her terrifyingly efficient. She knew every trick, every vulnerability, every lie a woman might tell herself to get through the night. Her power was absolute and primarily financial. She operated on a system of debt bondage that was nearly impossible to escape. A new girl arriving at her house, often fleeing poverty or scandal, was immediately put on the books. The fine dress she was required to wear, that was a debt. The food she ate, the roof over her head, the doctor's visits for the diseases she would inevitably contract, all of it was added to her tab at an exorbitant rate. The madame was the bookkeeper of souls. She would sit in her office, a ledger open in front of her, calmly adding another charge for a broken glass or a fine for insubordination, ensuring the numbers always grew, that the hope of ever being free was just a flickering candle in a hurricane. She was the one who enforced the hygiene standards, not for the woman's health, but for the business's reputation. She would inspect the girls, checking for signs of disease that might scare off the clientele. If a woman was found to be unclean, she wasn't sent to rest. She was either forced to service clients with more specialized tastes who didn't care, or she was kicked out onto the street with no money and a festering illness, a walking advertisement for what happens when you are no longer profitable. The madame's hypocrisy was breathtaking. She sold female flesh while maintaining a public facade of stern respectability. She demanded a performance of flirtatious charm from her girls while treating them like livestock. She was the gatekeeper, the warden, and the sole beneficiary of their slow degradation. Then there's the doctor. Again, erase the image of a kindly, Marcus Welby-type physician. The doctors who serviced this world were often on the fringes of the medical establishment, quacks and charlatans who saw a gold mine in sexual misery. They were the clean-up crew, the technicians of the body, and their authority was rooted in a terrifying combination of scientific jargon and sheer butchery. When a man contracted syphilis, he wouldn't go to his family doctor. He'd seek out one of these specialists, whose advertisements filled the back pages of newspapers, promising discreet and guaranteed cures. The cure was almost always mercury. Patients would be given mercury pills, mercury ointments, or even made to sit in steam cabinets filled with mercury vapor. The side effects were horrific. Profuse salivation, seen as a good sign that the disease was draining out, loosened teeth, tremors, kidney failure, and madness. The doctor would confidently pronounce the patient cured when his symptoms temporarily subsided, collect his fee, and send him back out into the world to spread the disease further, now with the added bonus of heavy metal poisoning. For women, the doctor was even more of a terror. He was the one who performed the hymenal inspections on new prostitutes, a humiliating and often brutal procedure to certify their, usually feigned, virginity for a high-paying client. He was the one called in to treat venereal diseases, often with the same mercury-based poisons or painful injections of silver nitrate. And most terrifyingly, he was the abortionist. Abortion was illegal and incredibly dangerous. The methods were barbaric, performed on a kitchen table with unsterilized instruments. The doctor might use a knitting needle, a wire, or a sharpened spoon to scrape out the contents of the uterus. The risk of hemorrhage, infection, and perforation was enormous. Many women died on that table, their bodies hastily disposed of. The doctor's power came from his monopoly on knowledge, however flawed and dangerous that knowledge was. He spoke a language of Latin terms and anatomical charts that intimidated and mystified his patients. He held the power of life and death, and he wielded it with a chilling detachment, often more concerned with collecting his fee than with the survival of the person in front of him. Together, the madam and the doctor formed a symbiotic pillar of authority. She created the conditions for disease and desperation. He profited from treating it. They were the twin faces of a system that commodified the body, policed it with shame, and then sold back a cure that was often just another form of poison. They held all the cards, and their game was always rigged. To truly understand the horror of Victorian sexual hygiene, we have to crawl inside the minds of the people living it. This wasn't just a physical battle, it was a psychological war, fought in a landscape of profound superstition, religious terror, and desperate self-justification. Their brains were as cluttered and contaminated as their bedrooms, filled with a toxic stew of bad information and existential dread. Let's start with the immense, suffocating weight of religion. For the average person, the act of sex outside of procreative marriage was not just a mistake, it was a mortal sin, a stain on their immortal soul that guaranteed an eternity of hellfire. This wasn't a vague, metaphorical concept. They believed, with every fiber of their being, in a literal, burning hell. Every single transaction in a brothel, every moment of non-procreative intimacy, was seen through this lens. A woman might whisper a frantic prayer before a client entered, not for safety, but for forgiveness, her mind a tangled mess of Catholic guilt and economic necessity. A man leaving a brothel might feel a wave of self-loathing, convinced he had just purchased his own damnation, a feeling that would curdle into resentment and blame directed at the woman he just left. This religious framework turned the body into a spiritual battleground. Disease, particularly syphilis, was often seen as divine punishment, a physical manifestation of moral corruption. They called it the wages of sin, and this belief created a vicious cycle of shame and silence. To admit you had a venereal disease was to publicly announce your own depravity. This meant people would hide their symptoms for as long as possible, secretly consulting quacks and allowing the disease to fester until it reached its horrific tertiary stage, all to avoid the social and spiritual condemnation that came with the diagnosis. It's hard to overstate how this core belief poisoned everything. It meant that seeking real help was impossible and that suffering was not just expected, but deserved. Then there was the layer of folk medicine and pure, unadulterated superstition that lay on top of the religious terror. This was a world where science was just beginning to claw its way out of the Dark Ages, and most people's understanding of the human body was a wild tapestry of nonsense. They believed in things like maternal impression, the idea that a pregnant woman's thoughts could physically alter her unborn child. If she saw something frightening, her baby could be born with a deformity. This added another layer of psychological torment to an unwanted pregnancy. Women clung to utterly useless contraceptive methods passed down through whispers and old wives' tales, things like sneezing violently after sex, or holding your breath, or drinking infusions of toxic herbs like pennyroyal, which could cause liver failure long before it terminated a pregnancy. Men carried good luck charms, special coins or amulets, believing they could ward off disease through magical means. There was a pervasive belief that venereal disease could be cured by passing it on to a virgin, a horrifying superstition that led to the systematic rape of countless children. This wasn't seen as monstrous in their twisted logic, it was a form of self-preservation. This mental landscape was a fertile ground for quackery. People were so desperate and so ignorant that they would believe anything. Advertisements for elixirs that promised to restore manly vigor or cure female complaints were everywhere. These were often just sugar water and alcohol, but people bought them, drank them, and believed in them because the alternative, that there was no easy cure, that they were truly doomed, was too terrible to contemplate. Finally, we have to look at the psychological justifications, the stories people told themselves to survive. The man visiting a prostitute might tell himself it was a biological necessity, a pressure valve that protected respectable women from his base urges. He was, in his own mind, performing a social service. He might frame it as a conquest, a reward for a hard week's work, reducing the woman to a commodity he had earned the right to consume. The prostitute's internal monologue was a masterclass in survival through dissociation. She would tell herself, "This is just a job. This isn't me. The person he is touching is not the real me." She would mentally retreat to a small, safe corner of her own mind, observing the transaction with a cold, clinical detachment. She might focus on the cracks in the ceiling, on counting the man's breaths, on anything other than the physical reality of what was happening to her body. This detachment was her only armor, but it came at a terrible cost, eroding her sense of self until sometimes there was nothing left but the hollow shell of the role she was forced to play. This internal world, a chaotic swirl of sin, superstition, and self-deception, is the crucial context. The chemical burns and the rusty instruments were only half the story. The real horror was happening in their heads, where every choice was weighed on a scale of eternal damnation, and every bodily fluid was a potential harbinger of doom. They were navigating a minefield, but the map they were given was drawn by madmen. The moment of truth arrives. All the anxious preparation, the psychological gymnastics, the simmering dread, it all culminates in the first point of contact. This is where the fragile illusions constructed by both parties shatter against the cold, hard reality of the encounter. It is never smooth. It is never romantic. It is a clumsy, awkward, and often shocking collision of two people trapped in a system that despises them both in different ways. Let's place ourselves in that dimly lit room in the high-class brothel. The man, let's call him a clerk or a mid-level businessman, has been drinking downstairs, stealing his nerves with overpriced whiskey. He's been fed a fantasy of sophisticated worldly seduction. He climbs the carpeted stairs, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and the madam shows him to a door. He steps inside. The first shock is the smell. The wave of cloying perfume he noticed downstairs is now overpowering in the small enclosed space, but it fails to mask a sharper, more antiseptic odor. The carbolic acid from the woman's preparatory douche. It's the smell of a hospital, not a boudoir, an immediate jarring reminder that this is a clinical transaction, not a romantic tryst. The woman is posed on the bed, a practiced tableau of allure. In the dim gaslight, she looks like the fantasy he paid for. But as he approaches, the illusion cracks. He sees the thick layer of lead-based powder on her face, a ghostly white mask that doesn't quite hide the fatigue around her eyes. He might see a small sore at the corner of her lip that she's tried to cover. He notices that her smile is a mechanical thing, a rictus of professionalism that doesn't reach her eyes. Her eyes are old, bored, and scanning him with a rapid, appraising gaze, calculating his drunkenness, his potential for violence, his value. The woman experiences her own series of shocks. She has seen 1,000 men like him, but each one is a new variable, a new potential for danger. She smells the sour liquor on his breath. She sees the tremor in his hands, a sign of nerves that could curdle into aggression. She feels the sweat on his palm as he takes her hand. Her mind is a rapid-fire checklist. Is he a talker, a brute, a quick fumbler? Will he try to negotiate the price down after the fact? Will he try to steal something? Her initial seduction is a practiced script, a series of questions designed to gauge the threat level. This initial phase is a negotiation not of love, but of terms. It's often brutally, comically direct. "What do you fancy, love?" she might ask, her voice devoid of any real warmth. The price, the duration, the specific acts. It's all laid out with the romance of a fish market transaction. The man, flustered, might try to play the part of the charming suitor, but the directness of the commerce cuts through his performance. This is where the clumsiness begins. He might trip on the rug. He might fumble with his own buttons, his fingers made clumsy by whiskey and nerves. The act of undressing, which in fantasy is a slow, sensual reveal, becomes a frantic, awkward struggle with unfamiliar Victorian clothing. Braces, starched collars, layers of petticoats. Now imagine this scene in the brutal squalor of a crib. There is no pretense of seduction to shatter. The shock is of a different, more visceral kind. The man, likely a labourer or a sailor, pulls back a canvas flap and is hit with a wall of stench, unwashed bodies, stale gin, and human waste. The woman is not posed on a bed. She is sitting on a lumpy straw pallet on the floor, her dress stained, her face gaunt. The shock here is the sheer, unvarnished misery of it all. The transaction is even more blunt. 2 bits for a lay, 5 for a fuck, she might say, her voice flat and raw from a consumptive cough. The first point of contact might be a rough hand grabbing her arm, pulling her down. There is no conversation, no illusion. It's pure, desperate biology meeting pure, desperate economics. In both scenarios, the first touch is the point of no return. It's the moment the abstract concept of sex becomes the terrifyingly specific reality of this person, this room, this smell. For the man, it's the shock that the woman is not a goddess or a fantasy object, but a tired, bored, or frightened human being whose body feels clammy or tense or just absent. For the woman, it's the shock of this specific man's weight, his smell, the texture of his skin. It's the moment her mental dissociation has to kick in, the moment she has to consciously disconnect her mind from the physical sensations her body is about to endure. This is the initial impact, the moment the car crash begins in slow motion. All the lies they told themselves, all the societal narratives evaporate in the face of this one stark, smelly, awkward, and deeply human moment. The fantasy is dead. Now, all that's left is the grinding, mechanical reality. After the initial jarring shock of first contact, the encounter descends into what can only be described as a grinding chaos. This isn't the elegant, passionate choreography of our fantasies. This is the messy, painful, and often absurd reality of the act itself, a midpoint slog where the human body, in all its leaky, fragile, and uncooperative glory, takes center stage. The focus here is on the minute, grotesque, anatomical details that historical fiction conveniently omits. Let's stay in that high-class brothel room for a moment. The grand bed, which looked so inviting from a distance, is now a landscape of misery. The horsehair mattress is not just lumpy, it's noisy. Every shift in weight, every rhythmic movement is accompanied by a dry, rustling, scratching sound, the sound of dead insects and dried straw. The sheets, though perhaps clean, are rough linen, scratchy against the skin. As the bodies warm, new smells are released into the already thick air. The scent of sweat, his smelling of whiskey, hers of a nervous metallic fear, mingles with the lingering carbolic acid and cheap perfume, creating a nauseating olfactory cocktail. It's the smell of a sick room, not a bedroom. The mechanics of the act are clumsy and fraught with peril. If the man is using one of those reusable sheep gut condoms, it's a constant source of anxiety. These things were notoriously ill-fitting, thick, and prone to slipping off or tearing. The sensation was dulled, described by one user as like being buggered through a brick wall. For the woman, it's a foreign object, a piece of treated animal intestine pushing inside her. The constant nagging fear for both of them is, did it break? A tear, invisible to the eye, could mean a pregnancy for her, a death sentence of syphilis for him. The stakes of this simple mechanical failure were astronomically high. Let's talk about the woman's primary contraceptive tool. The vinegar-soaked, or quinine-laced sponge. Imagine the physical sensation of that. A scratchy, abrasive object, saturated with a stinging astringent, lodged deep inside you. Every thrust is a new wave of irritation, a grinding of the harsh sponge against tissues that are already sensitive, perhaps even burned from a prior douche. It's not just uncomfortable, it's painful. She has to endure this while performing an ecstasy she absolutely does not feel, her mind a frantic loop of, is it still in place? Will it work? Please, God, let it work. The sounds of the encounter are not the moans of pleasure we hear in movies. It's a symphony of discomfort. The rhythmic squeaking of the bed springs, a monotonous, industrial sound. The man's heavy, labored breathing may be punctuated by a drunken grunt. The woman's own sounds are a performance, a series of calculated sighs and moans designed to speed the process along, to convince him he's getting his money's worth so he will finish and leave. But underneath that performance you might hear the rasp of her own breathing, tight with anxiety, or the faint, wet sound of a consumptive cough she's trying to suppress, knowing it's a sign of the disease that is slowly killing her and makes her less valuable. Now transpose this to the crib. The grinding chaos here is even more raw, stripped of any pretense. The straw pallet on the floor is not just lumpy, it's damp and cold. It crackles and shifts, and she can feel the hard, uneven floorboards through the thin layer of straw. The smell of raw sewage from the nearby alley might waft in. The sounds from the adjacent cribs, another transaction, a drunken argument, a woman sobbing, are the constant, inescapable soundtrack. There is no performance of pleasure here. It is silent, brutal, and fast. The man is focused on his own release, the woman on enduring the next few minutes without being beaten or catching another disease. The physical sensations are of grit, of dampness, of a body pushing against hers with no regard for her comfort or humanity. She can feel the chill of the floorboards on her back, the scratch of the straw on her skin. It is a purely mechanical act of friction, devoid of any emotion other than a desperate need for it to be over. In both settings, the body itself becomes a source of horror and betrayal. An erection might fail due to whiskey and nerves, leading to frustration and anger from the man, and a terrifying uncertainty for the woman. Will he blame her? Will he become violent? A woman might begin to bleed unexpectedly, a terrifying event in an age with no understanding of the menstrual cycle, seen as a sign of disease or defect. The body is not a source of pleasure, it is a faulty machine, prone to leaks, failures, and inconvenient biological realities. This midpoint slog is the heart of the experience. It's not a single, dramatic moment. It's the sustained, intimate horror of the thing itself. The close-up, sensory details, the smells, the sounds, the textures, reveal a world not of forbidden passion, but of painful, awkward, and deeply lonely work. It's the long, miserable grind before the inevitable and often anticlimactic conclusion. No matter how carefully prepared, no matter how cynically managed, these encounters were destined to go wrong. The human body is a messy, unpredictable thing, and when you combine its inherent frailties with ignorance, desperation, and dangerous chemicals, the result is an inevitable downfall. This isn't about dramatic tragedy, it's about the humiliation of anticlimax, the indignity of bodily failure, and the grotesque absurdity of things falling apart. The downfall often began with the simplest of failures, the failure of the male body to perform. In a world that equated masculinity with sexual potency, impotence was not just an inconvenience, it was a profound source of shame and rage. A man filled with cheap whiskey and high expectations might find himself unable to achieve or maintain an erection. The room, which was supposed to be a stage for his conquest, suddenly becomes a courtroom where he is the one on trial. His immediate reaction is rarely introspection. It's to lash out. He blames the woman. She's not attractive enough, not trying hard enough. She's unclean or used up. This can escalate from verbal abuse to physical violence in a heartbeat. For the woman, this is one of the most dangerous moments. She has to navigate his wounded ego, trying to coax or flatter him, all while knowing that his frustration could easily turn on her. The encounter ends not with a climax, but with a slammed door, a string of curses, and often no payment for her time and risk. Then there's the failure of the technology. That sheep gut condom, the armor, was a joke. A sudden, vigorous thrust, and the brittle, dried intestine splits. There's no dramatic sound, just a subtle shift in sensation. The man might not even notice until it's too late. The woman, more attuned to her own body, might feel the change immediately, a sudden warmth that brings with it a cold spike of terror. The act continues, but now it's a race against a biological clock. After he leaves, her frantic, painful douching with carbolic acid or mercury solution begins, a desperate, hopeless attempt to scour away the consequences of that tiny, catastrophic tear. The sponge contraceptive was another popular failure. It could be dislodged during the act, rendering it completely useless. Or, in a particularly horrifying scenario, the little ribbon tied to it for retrieval could break. Now the woman is left with a chemically saturated, semen-soaked sponge trapped deep inside her body. She might have to beg another prostitute to try and fish it out with her fingers, a painful and deeply humiliating process. If it can't be retrieved, it stays there, a festering ball of cotton and filth that will lead to a raging infection, pelvic inflammatory disease, and a slow, agonizing death from sepsis. The downfall could also be purely medical and deeply undignified. A man in the throes of a mercury cure for syphilis could have a sudden, violent reaction. He might begin to drool uncontrollably, a thick, stringy saliva that was a hallmark of mercury poisoning. He could suffer from violent muscle tremors, the hatter's shakes, turning the bed into a bucking, chaotic mess. Or he could have a seizure, his body convulsing, his eyes rolling back in his head, turning a sexual encounter into a terrifying medical emergency. The woman is left to deal with a twitching, incapacitated man, wondering if he will die in her room and what the madam will do to her if he does. For the woman, the downfall was often a quiet, internal, chemical betrayal. The harsh astringents she used as douches could cause a sudden, agonizing cramping in her uterine muscles. The lead in her face powder could give her a splitting headache and violent stomach pains mid-act. Her own body, assaulted by a daily regimen of poisons, would simply give out. The encounter would end with her doubled over in pain, vomiting into the chamber pot, a spectacle of misery that was bad for business and earned her a fine from the madam. Perhaps the most common and anticlimactic downfall was simply the premature, clumsy, and deeply unsatisfying conclusion. The man, overstimulated and drunk, might finish in a matter of seconds, leaving both parties feeling cheated. He feels shame and inadequacy. She feels relief, but also the frustration of having gone through the risk and the ritual for a pittance. The air is thick with a sense of failure. He dresses quickly, avoiding her eyes, throws the money on the nightstand, and flees into the night, leaving her in a room that now feels like the scene of a pathetic, embarrassing accident. This is the reality that punctures any fantasy of Victorian sexuality. It wasn't about passion and release. It was about failure, humiliation, and the body's infinite capacity for letting you down at the worst possible moment. The end was rarely a bang, but a whimper, a cough, a cramp, or the silent, terrifying realization that the flimsy barrier between you and ruin has just broken. In this relentless grind of exploitation and bodily decay, it's tempting to see the women as purely passive victims, but that erases their humanity. Buried beneath the layers of performance and endurance were small, often futile, but fiercely human moments of resistance. These weren't grand rebellions or successful escapes. Those were nearly impossible. Instead, they were tiny acts of sabotage, secret rebellions of the spirit, and desperate attempts to reclaim a sliver of agency in a world designed to strip them of it. These moments make the eventual failure all the more tragic, because they show us a spirit that was fighting, not one that was already broken. The most common form of resistance was financial. While the madame controlled the ledger, a clever woman could find ways to skim. She might develop the skill of the dip, lifting a few extra dollars from a drunken client's wallet as he fumbled with his trousers. It was a high-risk maneuver. Getting caught meant a brutal beating from the madame's enforcer. But that extra dollar, hidden away in a loose floorboard or a crack in the wall, represented more than just money. It was a secret, a victory, a tiny piece of her earnings that the system didn't get to swallow. It was the seed of a fantasy of one day having enough to buy a train ticket and disappear. This fantasy was almost never realized. The debt always grew faster than the secret stash, but the act of saving, of hiding, was itself an act of defiance. Another powerful form of resistance was the deliberate manipulation of the client's experience. While they were paid to provide a service, they retained a small measure of control over the quality of that service. For a regular client who was kind or a good tipper, a woman might offer a more convincing performance of enthusiasm, a bit of genuine conversation, a small kindness. But for a client who was cruel, cheap, or violent, she had her own subtle weapons. She could be clumsy on purpose, accidentally spilling a drink on him. She could be a dead fish, her body utterly limp and unresponsive, her silence a suffocating judgment that even the most oblivious man could feel. This was her quality control. It was her way of punishing the wicked and rewarding the decent, a small act of justice in a profoundly unjust world. The camaraderie between the women was another vital form of resistance. The system was designed to pit them against each other, to make them compete for the wealthiest clients or the madame's favor. But in the quiet moments, in the shared kitchen late at night, or while mending their clothes, a different world existed. Here they would share information: which men were dangerous, which police officers could be bribed, which quack doctors were the most lethal. They would share folk remedies for STDs or for inducing a miscarriage, however ineffective. They would share moments of pitch-black, gallows humor, mocking the absurdities of the men they serviced. A shared, cynical laugh at a particularly pompous client's expense was a powerful antidote to the soul-crushing despair of the job. These moments of connection were a refusal to be isolated, a creation of a community in the heart of a system designed to atomize them. And then there were the failed escapes. Every woman dreamed of leaving the life, but the reality was a brutal trap. The debt was the primary chain, but there was also violence, addiction to laudanum or alcohol provided by the madam, and the simple, crushing fact that there was nowhere for a fallen woman to go. But some still tried. A girl might save for months, finally accumulating enough for a train ticket, only to be caught by the madam's spies before she even reached the station. The punishment was swift and public, a beating designed not just to hurt her, but to terrorize the other women into compliance. Or she might actually make it out of the city, only to find that no respectable employer would hire her. Alone, broke and starving, she would inevitably drift back to the only work she could find, often ending up in a worse brothel than the one she fled. The story of the failed escape was a cautionary tale told again and again in the brothels, a constant reminder of the cage's invisible bars. There were even moments when the client, the customer, would revolt. A young man, perhaps on his first visit, might be so horrified by the reality, the smell, the woman's obvious despair, the squalor of the room, that he couldn't go through with it. He might simply apologize, leave the money on the table, and flee. For the woman, this was a moment of profound ambiguity. It was a relief, a night without risk, but it was also a confirmation of her own monstrosity in the eyes of the respectable world. His disgust was a mirror reflecting her own social damnation. These small acts of defiance rarely changed anything in the long run. The system was too powerful, the odds too stacked. But they are crucial to remember. They show that these women were not just broken objects. They were strategists, saboteurs, and survivors, fighting a desperate, losing battle to hold on to the last shreds of their own humanity. Just when you think things can't get any more miserable, any more degraded, history has a wonderful habit of introducing a wild card element. This is the unexpected complication, the sudden shift in the rules that takes a terrible situation and makes it exponentially worse, weirder, or more intensely dangerous. In the fragile ecosystem of the Victorian brothel, where everything was already balanced on a knife's edge, these wild cards would rip through the established order, leaving chaos and heightened terror in their wake. One of the most feared wild cards was the police raid. Now, don't mistake this for an act of moral justice. The police weren't there to save the women or punish the clients. The raid was a form of extortion, a business transaction with batons. Most brothels operated on a system of regular payoffs to the local constabulary. The madame paid a weekly or monthly fine to be left alone. But sometimes a new police captain would take over, or a public scandal would necessitate a show of force, and the unspoken agreement would be broken. The raid was a whirlwind of violence and panic. Doors would be kicked in, furniture overturned. The men inside, often prominent citizens, would scramble to find their trousers and escape out a back window, their respectability hanging by a thread. The women, however, had no escape. They would be rounded up, shoved into paddy wagons and hauled off to jail. The charge wasn't for being exploited, but for vagrancy or public nuisance. They would spend a night in a filthy, overcrowded cell, and in the morning they would be brought before a judge who would levy a fine. And who would pay the fine? The madam, of course, who would then add it to the woman's ever-increasing debt, tightening the chains of her servitude. The raid was a terrifying, humiliating piece of theatre that served only to reinforce the madam's power and bleed the women dry. Another terrifying wildcard was the arrival of the moral crusader. Figures like Anthony Comstock in the United States were fanatics obsessed with eradicating vice in all its forms. Comstock, armed with a law that bore his name, had the power to seize and destroy not just what he deemed obscene literature, but also any information or devices related to contraception or abortion. A visit from Comstock or one of his agents was a special kind of terror. It wasn't just about arrest, it was about ideological warfare. They would storm into a brothel or a private home, searching for forbidden items. A medical textbook showing female anatomy could be seized. A private letter between a husband and wife discussing family planning could be used as evidence for prosecution. For a prostitute, this meant frantically hiding her tools of the trade, the douching syringe, the contraceptive sponges, the bottle of quinine. If these were found, it was proof of her depravity. The Comstock laws created a climate of profound fear and ignorance, driving contraception even further underground and making it more dangerous. It was a holy war fought against women's bodies, and the Crusaders were the shock troops. Then there was the wild card of a sudden, violent epidemic. In an era with no antibiotics and a poor understanding of contagion, diseases like cholera, smallpox or influenza could sweep through a city with terrifying speed. A brothel, with its constant traffic of people from all walks of life, was a perfect incubator. When an epidemic hit, the authorities would often quarantine the red light district, trapping everyone inside. The brothels would be shuttered, the income stream cut off. The madame might lock the doors and abandon the house, leaving the women inside to starve or die of the disease. The women, already weakened by chronic illness and poor nutrition, were highly susceptible. An epidemic would turn a house of prostitution into a charnel house, the sounds of commerce replaced by the sounds of coughing, retching, and the quiet, lonely business of dying in a room that was never your own. Perhaps the most bizarre wildcard was a sudden shift in the market, a new fashion in perversion. A wealthy client might arrive with a specific, strange, and dangerous request. This could be anything from a demand for violent role-playing to an obsession with a particular physical attribute. The madame, always eyeing the bottom line, would often pressure a woman to comply, regardless of the risk. A new fad for hymenal inspections could lead to a series of brutal, invasive examinations by quack doctors. A new belief that syphilis could be cured by sex with a virgin could create a sudden, horrific market for child prostitutes, putting immense pressure on madams to procure younger and younger girls. This wild card wasn't a random event, it was a shift in the lusts of the powerful, and the consequences would ripple downwards, landing with brutal force on the bodies of the most vulnerable. These escalating factors shattered the bleak routine, replacing predictable misery with unpredictable terror. They revealed how fragile the women's world was, how easily their desperate strategies for survival could be upended by forces entirely outside their control. The greed of a cop, the fanaticism of a zealot, the random cruelty of a virus, or the shifting appetites of the men who paid their bills. The transaction is over. The client has fumbled his way out the door, leaving behind a few coins and a lingering smell of stale whiskey. The main event has concluded, but the story is far from over. Now begins the aftermath, the quiet, grotesque, and deeply personal fallout. This is the landscape of the morning after, a hollowed-out space filled with the physical and emotional detritus of the night. The tone here is one of exhaustion, a weary resignation to the grim mechanics of cleanup and triage. The first and most immediate act for the woman is a desperate, ritualistic cleansing. She stumbles out of the lumpy bed, her body aching, and heads for the washstand. The water in the ceramic basin is cold, maybe with a film of ice on top if it's winter. She plunges a rough cloth into it and begins to wash herself, not with any sense of care, but with a harsh, scrubbing motion. She is trying to erase the physical memory of the man's touch, to scrape away his scent, his sweat, his very presence from her skin. This is not about hygiene, it's about reclamation. Then comes the most critical part of the aftermath, the douching. This is not a choice. It is a frantic, non-negotiable necessity. She fills the vulcanized rubber syringe with her chosen chemical weapon, the stinging carbolic acid, the astringent alum, the poisonous mercury solution. Squatting over the foul-smelling chamber pot, she performs the painful, invasive procedure. The burn of the chemicals is a familiar agony, a self-inflicted punishment that she prays will be enough to ward off the twin spectres of pregnancy and disease. She is waging war on her own interior, trying to render her body a barren, sterile wasteland. The immediate physical evidence of the encounter must be dealt with. The stained sheets have to be stripped from the bed. In a high-class house, they might be bundled away for a laundress. In a crib, she might have to wash them herself in a bucket of cold, greasy water, her hands raw from the harsh lye soap. If a sheep gut condom was used, it must be retrieved from the floor or the bedclothes. It's a grim task picking up the slimy, discarded thing. It can't be thrown away. These were expensive and reusable. It has to be washed, dried carefully, and powdered with talc, ready for the next client. It's a disgusting, intimate chore that underscores the relentlessly commercial nature of the act. The room itself is a landscape of small grotesqueries. A half-empty glass of gin sits on the nightstand, attracting a fly. The candle has sputtered out, leaving a trail of hardened wax on the floor. The air is thick and stagnant, a layered history of the night's smells. The woman moves through this space with a mechanical efficiency, tidying up, restoring the room to a state of readiness for the next transaction. It's the work of a stagehand, breaking down one set and preparing for the next scene in a play that never ends. Then there is the triage of the body. She examines herself in a small, cracked mirror, looking for new bruises, for scratches, for any sign of a tear. She inspects her own body with the cold, detached eye of a mechanic looking for a faulty part. Every new mark is a liability, something that might have to be explained to the madam, something that might lower her value. This is also the moment of looting, if you can call it that. She counts the money the man left. Is it the agreed-upon amount? Often it's not. Men would shortchange them, knowing there was little recourse. If she was successful in dipping an extra dollar from his pocket, she quickly hides it away before the madame comes to collect her share. The madame's cut was usually 50% or more, not including the endless debts for room and board. The pittance left over is the tangible result of the risk, the pain, the humiliation. It's a pathetic sum that barely covers her existence, ensuring she can never get ahead. The immediate psychological aftermath is a profound emptiness. The high-alert state of the encounter gives way to a dull, hollow ache. The adrenaline fades, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. Many women would reach for an escape, a swig of gin, a dose of laudanum, anything to numb the senses and blur the edges of the grim reality. This wasn't for pleasure. It was medication, a way to quiet the mind and get through to the next day, the next client. In this quiet, exhausted aftermath, the full weight of the experience settles in. The room is no longer a stage, it's a cage. The tools of the trade are not instruments of seduction, they are instruments of self-harm. The body is not a source of power, it's a liability, a site of constant low-grade warfare. The performance is over, the audience is gone, and she is left alone with the quiet, festering consequences. The immediate physical cleanup is one thing. The long-term, invisible damage is another entirely. Once the room is tidied and the sheets are changed, the real trauma begins to set in, burrowing deep into the psyche. The psychological scars left by this life were profound and permanent, and the coping mechanisms were as dark and destructive as the system itself. This wasn't post-traumatic stress as we understand it now. It was a state of continuous, unending trauma where the only way to survive the present was to methodically destroy your own soul. The most common and necessary coping mechanism was a profound emotional numbness, to feel the full weight of every encounter, every humiliation, every act of violence would be to go insane. So the women learned to disconnect. They built a wall inside their minds, separating their physical body from their sense of self. The me who endures the nightly degradation was not the real me. This real me was kept locked away, a tiny, flickering flame of consciousness that observed the proceedings from a great distance. This dissociation was a brilliant survival strategy in the short term, but it was corrosive. Over time, the wall would become permanent. The woman would lose the ability to feel anything at all, not just pain, but joy, love, and connection. She became a spectator in her own life, a ghost haunting her own body. This hollowness was often mistaken for hardness or cynicism, but it was the scar tissue of a spirit that had been systematically amputated. Dark, gallows humor was another essential tool for survival, especially in the moments of camaraderie between the women. They would mock the physical absurdities of their clients, their pathetic attempts at seduction, their hypocritical piety. They would give them cruel, secret nicknames. This laughter, shared over a late-night cup of gin, was not joyful. It was a bitter, angry, defiant sound. It was a way of saying, "You may own my body for an hour, but you do not own my contempt. I see you for the ridiculous, pathetic creature you are." This humor was a small way of reclaiming power, of turning the objectifying gaze back on the men who wielded it. It was a shield against despair, a proof that their critical, intelligent minds were still alive, even if they had to be hidden. But numbness and humor were often not enough. Chemical coping was rampant. Laudanum, An alcoholic tincture of opium was cheap, legal, and readily available. It was the Victorian era's cure-all, prescribed for everything from a cough to female hysteria. For a prostitute, it was an essential tool of the trade. A dose before a difficult client could blur the edges of the experience, making it bearable. A dose after could bring a dreamless, numbing sleep. Alcohol served the same purpose. The madame often encouraged this dependency, sometimes even providing the first doses for free. An addicted woman was a compliant woman, a woman less likely to cause trouble, less likely to try and escape. The addiction became another chain, another entry in the ledger of debt, binding her to the brothel as surely as any iron shackle. The lingering trauma also manifested physically in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety. The women lived in a state of hypervigilance. Every approaching footstep, every raised voice could signal danger. This produced a host of physical symptoms: insomnia, stomach ailments, chronic headaches, trembling hands. Their bodies were in a perpetual state of fight or flight, flooded with stress hormones that ground them down, aged them prematurely, and made them more susceptible to the very diseases they feared. For the men, the psychological scars were different, but no less real. The primary trauma was fear, the all-consuming terror of venereal disease. After an encounter, a man would enter a period of anxious waiting, a 2 to 3 week countdown of dread. He would obsessively check his own body for the first sign, the telltale sore, the rash, the weeping lesion. This fear could curdle into a deep-seated paranoia and a venomous hatred of women whom he blamed for his own risk-taking. He saw them not as human beings, but as vectors of contagion, poisonous vessels of temptation and disease. This psychological framework allowed him to absolve himself of any responsibility, cementing the social narrative that the fallen woman was the sole source of sexual corruption. The trauma for both men and women was a cycle of fear and blame. The woman's trauma was one of enduring violence and exploitation, leading to a retreat from her own humanity. The man's trauma was one of fearing the consequences of his own actions, leading to a projection of his guilt and terror onto the very women he exploited. In the end, there were no winners, only different kinds of ghosts, haunted by the memory of the filth, the fear, and the profound, aching loneliness of it all. The personal traumas, the individual agonies happening in those dim, squalid rooms, were not isolated incidents. They were the engines of a vast, sprawling social and economic machine. The cumulative effect of these millions of toxic encounters sent ripples, or more accurately, tidal waves of filth and misery crashing through every level of Victorian society. The personal became public, and the consequences were catastrophic, shaping public health, urban economies, and the very laws of the land. The most visible and devastating ripple effect was the public health crisis. Syphilis and gonorrhea were not just problems for the red light districts. They were rampant epidemics that respected no social class. A businessman would contract syphilis from a prostitute, bring it home to his unsuspecting wife, who would then pass it on to her unborn child, resulting in a baby born with congenital syphilis, a horrifying condition causing blindness, deafness, and severe deformities. The disease spread silently from the brothels to the drawing rooms, a secret plague that hollowed out families from the inside. The so-called cures only made things worse. The widespread use of mercury by quack doctors created a secondary epidemic of heavy metal poisoning, with symptoms like tremors, memory loss, and kidney failure becoming common. The societal response to this was not to promote education or effective prevention, but to blame and punish women. In Britain, this culminated in the infamous Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s. These laws gave police the power to arrest any woman merely suspected of being a prostitute in port towns and garrison cities. She could then be subjected to a forced, often brutal, internal examination with a speculum to check for signs of venereal disease. If she was found to be infected, she was locked away in a lock hospital, until she was deemed clean and could be sent back to work. The men who were infecting her and who were the primary spreaders of the disease were completely exempt from this system. The law institutionalized the ultimate hypocrisy. A woman's body was a public menace to be policed, while a man's body was a private matter. The economic impact was staggering. Prostitution wasn't a fringe activity, it was a cornerstone of the urban economy. The brothels themselves were major businesses paying rent, buying vast quantities of liquor, food, and laundry services. The madams were often wealthy, powerful figures who owned property and wielded significant informal influence. The money generated by the sex trade flowed upwards and outwards, lining the pockets of landlords, police captains, liquor suppliers, and city officials. In many towns, especially in the American West, the brothel was the largest and most profitable enterprise, its revenue propping up the entire local economy. This created a profound civic hypocrisy. The same city fathers who preached morality from the pulpits on Sunday were often the landlords collecting rent from the brothels on Monday. They passed laws to regulate vice, which were really just systems for taxing and profiting from it. The existence of a permanent, desperate class of women was not a social problem to be solved. It was a business model to be maintained. Then there was the social crisis of the next generation. What happened to the children born from these encounters? An unwanted pregnancy was a disaster. A woman who gave birth would lose her livelihood. The children were often abandoned, left on the steps of churches or orphanages. These institutions were chronically underfunded and overwhelmed with appallingly high mortality rates. The children who survived grew up with an immense social stigma, often with no knowledge of their parentage. For the girls, the cycle often repeated itself. With no education, no family, and no prospects, many were drawn back into the same life that had produced them. The orphanages and foundling homes became, in effect, recruitment centers for the next generation of prostitutes. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of poverty and exploitation, a societal ripple that echoed for generations. The law and the social crusades that rose in opposition often made things worse. The Comstock laws, by banning contraceptive information, ensured that unwanted pregnancies and dangerous back-alley abortions would continue unabated. The moral purity campaigns, while publicly decrying the evils of prostitution, often resulted in crackdowns that only made life more dangerous for the women, driving them into the hands of more ruthless pimps and madams who could offer protection from the law. The societal ripple effect reveals the true nature of the system. It wasn't just a collection of individual sins, it was a fully integrated social and economic structure. It was a machine that ran on female bodies, lubricated by hypocrisy, and produced three main products: disease, profit, and a steady supply of fresh victims to keep the whole grotesque enterprise running. After all the pain, the filth, the disease, and the death, comes the final, most bitter insult: the rewriting of history. The brutal reality of this world, a world built on sexual exploitation and medical butchery, does not survive in our popular memory. Instead, it undergoes a grotesque sanitization. The horror is scrubbed away, the trauma is forgotten, and the whole sordid business is repackaged into a romantic, adventurous, or even heroic myth. This process of historical laundering is perhaps the most cynical act of all, because it ensures that the lessons of the past are never truly learned. It's a collective act of forgetting, a story we tell ourselves to feel better about the foundations on which our modern world was built. Let's look at the saloon girl of the American West. In our movies and novels, she is a vibrant, witty character. She has a heart of gold, a sassy retort for every cowboy, and is often the moral center of a lawless town. She wears a colorful can-can dress, serves whiskey with a wink, and is secretly in love with the stoic, honorable sheriff. This is a complete and utter fabrication. The reality was the crib, the lice-infested straw pallet, the $2 transaction, the constant threat of violence, the syphilis, the botched abortions, the crushing debt to the saloon owner who was also her pimp. The sassy personality was a performance to hide her terror. The heart of gold was a fantasy projected onto her by a society that needed to believe that even in the depths of degradation, a woman could remain pure and redemptive. We've replaced the image of a woman dying of a uterine hemorrhage with a picture of her singing on a piano. We've erased the syphilis and replaced it with a tragic, unrequited love story. The myth serves a crucial purpose. It turns a story of brutal female exploitation into a story about rugged male adventure. The prostitute becomes a colorful set dressing for the hero's journey, her own story completely erased. The same sanitization happens to the figure of the madam. The ruthless, debt-mongering businesswoman is transformed into a wise, worldly matriarch, a tough but fair protector of her girls. She is depicted as a figure of female empowerment, a woman who succeeded in a man's world. This narrative conveniently ignores the fact that her success was built entirely on the systematic destruction of other women. We celebrate her as a renegade entrepreneur while forgetting that her business model was indistinguishable from slavery. Her ledger of debt becomes a symbol of her business acumen, not the instrument of torture that it truly was. The medical horror show is similarly whitewashed. We remember the Victorian era for its scientific progress, for Darwin, for Pasteur, for the dawn of modern medicine. We conveniently forget that for the average person, medicine was still a terrifying landscape of quackery and poison. The mercury cures, the carbolic acid douches, the lead-based cosmetics, all of this is relegated to a historical footnote, a quirky anecdote about how silly people used to be. We don't connect it to the real, agonizing deaths it caused. We frame the doctors not as the often incompetent, greedy charlatans they were, but as well-meaning pioneers fumbling in the dark. Their butchery is recast as a necessary step on the long march to progress. This rewriting of history is a form of societal gaslighting. It takes the lived experience of millions of people, particularly women, and tells them that their suffering wasn't that bad, that it was actually kind of romantic, that it served a noble purpose. It's a deeply cynical process that prioritizes comforting narratives over uncomfortable truths. We do this because the reality is too ugly to face. The reality implicates the entire structure of society, the economy, the law, the church, the family. It's easier to create a myth of sassy saloon girls and tough-as-nails madams than it is to admit that our great nations were built on a foundation of sexual misery and institutionalized abuse. The bitter legacy isn't just that the story was forgotten, it's that it was deliberately, methodically, and successfully replaced with a lie. A beautiful, comforting, and deeply poisonous lie. So, we've taken a long, hard look at the lie. We've seen how the grotesque reality of sexual exploitation and hygienic horror was meticulously scrubbed, polished, and mounted in the museum of our collective memory as a romantic tableau of the good old days. The image of the sassy saloon girl with a heart of gold triumphs over the reality of the terrified girl in a crib dying of sepsis. The legend of the bold, entrepreneurial madam eclipses the truth of the ruthless trafficker. We tell ourselves these sanitized stories because the truth is unbearable. The truth is that the systems of power that created this misery, the commodification of bodies, the policing of female sexuality, the profit-driven hypocrisy, were not some bizarre historical anomaly. They are the very bedrock of the world we still inhabit. And that brings us to the final, bleak reflection. The real horror isn't what they did back then, it's how little the fundamental dynamics have changed. We've just gotten better at hiding the filth. We traded the visible, tangible grime of the 19th century for a sleek, digital, and far more insidious form of the same exploitation. We swapped the vulcanized rubber syringe for the dating app, the sheep gut condom for the dick pic, the madame's ledger for the terms and conditions you scroll past without reading. We look back with smug superiority at their medical ignorance, at their mercury cures and carbolic acid douches. But are we any better? We live in an age of wellness influencers selling detox teas that are just expensive laxatives, and biohackers promoting unproven, dangerous protocols for a fantasy of human optimization. We've replaced the quack doctor with the unlicensed life coach, the mercury elixir with the jade egg. The snake oil is now just packaged in minimalist, Instagram-friendly branding. The fundamental grift is the same, preying on our deepest insecurities about our bodies and our health, selling a magical cure for the universal condition of being a fragile, decaying animal. We recoil at the brutal economics of the crib, where a human being was reduced to a $2 transaction. But look around. We live in a gig economy that atomizes labor, strips away benefits, and forces people into a precarious, desperate hustle for survival. We praise the disruptive innovation of apps that allow us to summon another human being to deliver our food, drive our car, or assemble our furniture for a pittance, all while convincing ourselves that this isn't exploitation, it's flexibility. We've just made the cribs digital and called it progress. The transaction is cleaner, less smelly, but is it any less dehumanizing? The core of the Victorian system was the separation of intimacy from humanity, the transformation of a human connection into a consumer good. Today, we swipe through faces on a screen, reducing potential partners to a series of flattering photos and a witty bio. We ghost, we breadcrumb, we orbit. We engage in a form of low-stakes, high-volume emotional commerce that leaves us feeling profoundly isolated, all while chasing the fantasy of a perfect match that the algorithm promises is just one more swipe away. We are still buying and selling, still performing, still terrified of the messy, unpredictable reality of another human being. The names and the technologies have changed, but the game remains horrifyingly familiar. The lust, the power, the shame, the desperate search for a quick fix for our loneliness and our mortality, it's all still here, pulsing just beneath the clean, modern surface of our lives. So I'll leave you with this. We look back at them and we see filth. They looked at Ashanka and saw the hand of God. We look at our glowing screens and see connection. What do you think future generations will see when they look back at us? Look at your own clean, modern hands. Are you sure they are